Welcome to a neighborhood story that's caught the attention of thousands online. What begins as a petty dispute over a trash can quickly spirals into a full-blown war, dividing neighbors, sparking legal battles, and attracting viral fame. This is The Trash Can War, a story about entitlement, retaliation, and how small disputes can turn into chaos. But before we get into it, drop in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into how it all started. It began as most neighborhood wars do, with something small. Too small to seem real at first. A trash can. A simple, gray, plastic bin sitting quietly at the edge of a driveway in a picture-perfect suburb called Havenbrook Meadows. Havenbrook was the kind of neighborhood that advertised itself as community-driven. Every lawn looked cloned, every porch identical. But beneath that illusion of suburban harmony, there was an invisible rulebook. One written, enforced, and guarded by one woman. Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-appointed guardian of perfection. Her house gleamed brighter than the sun, her bushes trimmed into perfect spheres, her mailbox freshly painted every other month. She wasn't just part of the homeowners association, she was the homeowners association. And in her mind, that meant she owned every blade of grass on the block. Across from her lived Daniel Cole, a quiet, hard-working homeowner who had moved into Havenbrook for peace, not politics. But peace is a fragile thing when you're neighbors with a Karen. The first incident was small. Daniel had left his trash can at the curb overnight. One night, he'd been late from work, exhausted, and told himself he'd bring it in the next morning. But by sunrise, it wasn't just sitting there. It had been dragged halfway up his driveway, lid open, and a printed HOA violation notice taped to it. The notice had Karen's signature. Daniel ignored it. He figured it wasn't worth the energy. But to Karen, being ignored was a personal attack. By the next week, she'd taken photographs of his unsightly can and posted them to the neighborhood Facebook page. She even filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, of which she was, conveniently, the president. Soon, Daniel was summoned to a meeting. The board discussed his trash can placement as if it were a national crisis. It was absurd, humiliating even, but he swallowed his pride and promised to be more careful. For a short time, things returned to normal. But Karen's thirst for control wasn't satisfied. She had tasted authority and wanted more. Every morning, she'd inspect the street like a hawk, measuring lawns, snapping photos, and jotting notes into her clipboard. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was policing it. And when she realized Daniel's recycling bin was occasionally placed 2 inches over the line separating his driveway from the street, she struck again. Another violation notice. Another photo. Another Facebook post about non-compliance. Daniel tried to ignore her, but her obsession grew bolder. She began knocking on his door, lecturing about rules, and even trespassing onto his property to inspect his bins. He caught her once, camera in hand, peering into his backyard as if she were conducting an investigation. Then came the day that broke everything. It was trash collection morning. Daniel's bin, neatly placed at the curb, was waiting for pickup. But by the time the truck arrived, the bin was gone. Vanished. Confused, Daniel looked around until he saw it. His trash can, tipped over on Karen's lawn, garbage spilling out, and Karen herself standing with her phone out, snapping pictures. Within an hour, police cruisers rolled up. Karen had called the cops, over a trash can. She told them Daniel had illegally dumped garbage on her property. The officers were professional but clearly bewildered. They quickly realized it was a neighbor dispute and left, warning both parties to keep things civil. But civility had already died on Havenbrook Lane. That night, Daniel sat in silence on his porch, watching the glow from Karen's windows. Every moment replayed in his head, the humiliation, the false accusation, the smug satisfaction on her face as the police stood there. And something inside him snapped. He was done being the victim of her petty crusade. He was done living under the dictatorship of a clipboard. If she wanted to treat his trash like a crime, then fine, he'd give her a real trash problem. It started as a thought, then a plan. A meticulous, calculated, and poetic plan. One that would teach Karen a lesson she'd never forget. The next morning, Daniel began collecting. He rented a small trailer. He drove to construction sites, helping workers dispose of their unwanted debris. He offered to take old furniture off neighbors' hands, broken appliances, even scrap wood. Everyone was happy to unload what they didn't need. Slowly, his backyard became a collection zone, a mountain of junk, trash, and discarded pieces of suburbia. Old couches, cracked toilets, rusted bikes, half-empty paint cans. It looked chaotic, but every piece had a purpose. Neighbors began to whisper. They didn't know what Daniel was planning, only that something was happening. Karen, of course, noticed immediately. She watched from her window, binoculars in hand, scribbling in her notebook like a detective. And then one morning, she woke to a sight that made her jaw drop. Daniel was outside, backed by a rented forklift. He was hauling loads of garbage, directly toward her pristine front yard. By the time she stepped outside, her perfect green lawn had become a dumping ground. Layer after layer of junk piled higher and higher, until her once picture-perfect home looked like the aftermath of a demolition site. Karen screamed, but Daniel just kept working, methodical, unstoppable, unbothered. Neighbors came out with phones in hand, recording the chaos. Some laughed. Some gasped. But no one stopped him. After all, she had called the cops over a trash can, now she was living inside one. By sunset, Karen's yard had transformed into a mountain of garbage. An ironic monument to her obsession with control. The video spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By nightfall, it hit the internet. Karen gets dumpstered by neighbor became the headline. Within hours, millions watched. But while the world laughed, Havenbrook didn't. The HOA erupted. The local news arrived. The cops returned. And what started as petty revenge was about to spiral into something far bigger. As flashing lights painted the quiet cul-de-sac, Daniel realized his one act of defiance had crossed into viral chaos. And somewhere behind those flashing lights, Karen was already plotting her next move. Because if there was one thing she couldn't stand more than trash, it was losing control. And that's exactly what she was about to do. By morning, Havenbrook Meadows was no longer the calm, spotless neighborhood it once pretended to be. Word had spread faster than wildfire. The street was crowded with neighbors, phones out, whispering in disbelief as they stared at the towering heap of junk that now buried Karen Whitmore's immaculate front yard. What had once been the symbol of order and control now looked like a landfill in the middle of paradise. The air was thick with the smell of old paint and damp wood. Broken fences leaned against rusted appliances. Torn lawn chairs and shattered flower pots lay scattered like casualties of suburban warfare. And in the center of it all stood Karen, her pastel blazer now stained with dust, her hair disheveled, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as if her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. Daniel watched quietly from his porch. No smirk, no satisfaction on his face, only a strange calm. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't gloated. He'd simply given her exactly what she wanted to accuse him of: garbage. But this wasn't just about trash anymore. It was about control, power, ego. By noon, the police returned. So did the HOA board, clutching clipboards like shields. Karen marched straight to them, trembling with fury, pointing at the mess as if it were a crime scene. The officers, patient but clearly exhausted by the ongoing feud, took notes and photos. One even sighed, recognizing both faces from their last encounter. The HOA demanded immediate cleanup. Karen demanded arrest. Daniel, however, had already prepared. Every load he dumped was from people who had given him permission to remove their garbage. Every item was documented. Every photograph time-stamped. It wasn't technically illegal, just unneighborly. And in a twisted way, poetic. The cops found themselves trapped between absurdity and legality. They couldn't arrest a man for piling trash on private property with implied permission. And when Karen screamed that she never gave such permission, Daniel simply pointed to a document he'd printed and taped to a post on her lawn. Community donation site, authorized by HOA complaint number 472. It wasn't real authorization, of course. But it looked official enough to confuse anyone unfamiliar with HOA politics. The standoff stretched into the evening. Cameras arrived. News crews set up tripods. Reporters asked questions no one wanted to answer. The footage of Karen yelling beside a mountain of garbage played on loop across the internet. Overnight, she became the HOA Karen. Memes, hashtags, and jokes flooded social media. People called her Trash Queen of Havenbrook. Someone even created a fake account pretending to be her, posting outrageous HOA rules like, only birds with HOA-approved feathers may enter the neighborhood. But behind that viral fame was something darker. Karen wasn't just embarrassed, she was unraveling. She spent hours pacing her porch, calling city inspectors, environmental officers, even lawyers. But every call ended the same way. No one could help until ownership and liability were sorted out. The HOA technically owned the land easement in front of her house, which meant her precious lawn wasn't entirely hers to defend. Daniel had found the one loophole she couldn't close. Still, he didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He watched as she spiraled, as neighbors who once praised her now avoided eye contact. People who used to attend her meetings crossed the street when she walked by. The power she once wielded through fear and rules had crumbled beneath the weight of her own arrogance. But power doesn't disappear, it mutates. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Karen arrived early, her hair tied tight, her clipboard like a sword. The room was tense. The once loyal board members were split. Some wanted peace, others wanted punishment. And Karen wanted war. She framed Daniel's act as domestic terrorism of the suburban kind. She claimed emotional distress, property damage, and defamation. She demanded full HOA funding to restore order and vowed to file a lawsuit. The motion barely passed. Karen had just enough allies to begin her next phase. Retaliation through the system she once built. Soon, Daniel began receiving letters. Dozens of them. HOA fines, citations, and threats of liens for fabricated violations, peeling paint, improper fence height, non-regulation lawn decorations. Each fine was absurd, each complaint clearly retaliatory. But every one was stamped official. And with the internet still laughing at Karen, she doubled down. She filed noise complaints at random hours. She photographed his car parked an inch over the line. She even claimed his grass was too green compared to the community standard. The harassment was relentless, and Daniel began to feel the pressure. His mailbox filled faster than he could empty it. His phone buzzed with calls from HOA representatives quoting rule numbers like legal scriptures. But Daniel wasn't the same man who'd been humiliated over a trash can. He'd learned her game, and he knew how to play it better. He stopped reacting. He paid nothing. Instead, he began collecting evidence. Every letter. Every timestamp. Every neighbor who'd witnessed Karen's vendetta. And slowly, a new plan began to form. A quieter plan. While Karen built her war through paperwork and outrage, Daniel built his through patience and precision. He began recording her rants, documenting her trespasses, and filing countercomplaints, not to the HOA, but to the city council. Weeks turned into months, and Havenbrook's perfect image continued to crumble. The HOA's credibility faltered. Home values dipped. Realtors stopped recommending the area. All because of one feud born from a trash can. But Karen didn't see the bigger picture. She was too busy fighting to notice the storm gathering behind her. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rows of uniform houses, Daniel received a letter that made him smile for the first time in months. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the city. A notice of investigation into HOA misconduct, citing potential abuse of power and misappropriation of funds. The investigation had been triggered by a compilation of documents, photos, and reports, anonymous, but detailed. Karen didn't know it yet, but the walls she built were closing in. And just as she began preparing her civil lawsuit against Daniel, she'd find herself facing something far more devastating. Because the same system she'd weaponized was about to turn on her. The trash had been cleared, but the real cleanup was just beginning. The investigation into the Havenbrook Meadows Homeowners Association began quietly. A few phone calls, a few letters, a few polite visits from city officials asking for records and transparency. At first, Karen treated it as a nuisance. She believed it was nothing more than a formality, a misunderstanding that her perfect documentation could easily fix. After all, she had always prided herself on her meticulous record-keeping, every violation, every complaint, every receipt neatly cataloged in color-coded binders. But what Karen didn't realize was that her obsession with control had left a trail longer than she could imagine. The city's compliance team wasn't looking for perfection, they were looking for patterns, and what they found was damning. Fines issued without cause. Violations fabricated without board approval. HOA funds redirected to beautification projects that existed only in her imagination. And at the center of it all, her signature. Meanwhile, Daniel kept his distance. He didn't need to say anything. The machine she had built was dismantling itself, one audit at a time. He simply watched from his porch as the tide of control began to turn. For years, Karen had ruled Havenbrook like a monarch. But now, the subjects she once commanded began to whisper against her. Neighbors who had once feared her now spoke freely. Stories poured out about harassment, intimidation, selective enforcement, and fines that never made sense. They spoke of cameras mounted on poles, emails sent at midnight, and Karen's constant presence outside their homes, clipboard in hand like a weapon. The perfect suburb had always been built on fear, and now that fear was crumbling. When the city summoned the HOA board for a formal hearing, the turnout was overwhelming. Residents filled the room, their faces tight with years of frustration. Some brought documents. Others brought photos. Many just came to watch the fall of a woman who had ruled them too long. Karen arrived early as always. Her hair pulled back, her pastel suit pressed, her expression cold and resolute. She believed she could still win. She believed that logic, rules, and authority would save her. But logic was no longer on her side. The city's investigator, calm and methodical, began to lay out the evidence. Hundreds of fines issued without legal justification, funds rerouted from community projects to administrative expenses, and dozens of residents targeted disproportionately. Every page of proof was another crack in Karen's carefully constructed empire. For the first time in years, she didn't speak. Her eyes darted, her pen tapping against the table as each allegation landed like a hammer. The woman who had dictated the rules was now being judged by them. And in the back of the room, Daniel sat quietly, unseen by most, watching the downfall unfold. The hearing stretched for hours. The board members, once loyal, began to distance themselves. One by one, they claimed ignorance, that Karen handled everything, that they had trusted her leadership. Her support system evaporated before her eyes, leaving her alone beneath the weight of her own arrogance. When it was over, the city ordered a full suspension of the HOA's authority pending further investigation. The board was dissolved. Karen was removed as president. Her access to HOA accounts was revoked, and the state attorney's office was notified of potential financial misconduct. The empire of Havenbrook Meadows had fallen in a single day. But while the neighborhood celebrated in silence, Karen's fury only deepened. The next morning, she stood on her porch, staring at the empty space where the mountain of trash had once stood. The lawn was dead now, a patchy brown scar in the center of an otherwise flawless street. She saw it as a symbol of her humiliation. To her, Daniel wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was the enemy who had destroyed her reputation, her authority, and her identity. And that was something she could never forgive. She withdrew from public view for a while, curtains drawn, blinds closed. The once busy HA newsletter stopped printing. The Facebook page went silent. But beneath that silence, something was brewing. Daniel noticed small signs, tire marks near his mailbox, missing trash cans, motion lights flickering off unexpectedly. It was subtle at first, but it grew more deliberate with time. Someone was trying to provoke him again, to bait him into another confrontation. Yet he stayed calm. He knew how this story worked now. Karen thrived on reaction, and silence was the one thing she couldn't control. But while he ignored her, the internet did not. The viral video of her meltdown outside her garbage-filled yard was now climbing into the millions. Commentators, YouTubers, and online drama channels dissected every frame. The public had turned her name into a meme, a living symbol of entitlement and control gone wrong. Her house became a landmark for local curiosity seekers. Cars slowed down to take photos. Teenagers left trash bags on her driveway as pranks. Every time she cleaned them up, more appeared. Her perfect life had turned into a spectacle, and she couldn't escape it. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued. Each time Karen tried to appeal, more evidence surfaced. Her credit dropped. Her reputation shattered. The HOA bank account, once her personal tool of authority, was frozen. Meanwhile, Daniel lived quietly. The neighborhood grew friendlier without the HOA's shadow. Kids played outside again. Neighbors waved. It was peaceful, even if temporary. But peace, as Daniel had learned, was fragile in Havenbrook. Because one late afternoon, just as the sun began to set, a truck pulled into Karen's driveway. Not a moving truck, but a dumpster delivery. A large, bright orange industrial dumpster. Daniel watched from across the street, puzzled. The truck unloaded it and left. For hours, Karen didn't come outside. But the next morning, she did, wearing gloves, a mask, and determination. She began hauling her possessions into the dumpster. Decorations, furniture, even pieces of her fence. It was as if she were erasing herself from the neighborhood one item at a time. Word spread quickly. Some said she was moving. Others said she was losing her home. But the truth was stranger. The city had declared her property in violation of numerous ordinances. Between unpaid fines, legal fees, and cleanup costs, her once pristine home was now part of an official foreclosure process. The woman who once ruled every lawn was about to lose her own. And Daniel, standing in quiet disbelief, realized that revenge had gone further than he ever intended. He hadn't meant for her life to collapse, only for her to understand the weight of her actions. But now, watching her shovel debris into that dumpster, he couldn't shake the feeling that the line between justice and destruction had blurred. Karen had spent years turning her neighbors' lives into misery. And now, she was living in the mess she created, both literally and figuratively. But fate wasn't done with either of them yet. Because just as she seemed to disappear from the picture, a letter arrived in Daniel's mailbox, thick, official, and stamped with a law firm's seal. Karen Whitmore, it seemed, wasn't finished. She was coming back, not as an HOA president, but as a plaintiff. And the next battle would be fought not in the streets, but in court. The envelope sat on Daniel's porch like a quiet threat. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with the name of a law firm that specialized in civil litigation and property disputes. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Karen Whitmore, the woman who once ruled the neighborhood with a clipboard, who'd been humiliated before millions, who had watched her empire crumble into a pile of garbage, was back. And this time, she was fighting not with HOA rules, but with the full weight of the law. The letter was polished, calculated, and venomous. It accused Daniel of property defacement, emotional distress, and intentional public humiliation. Attached were printed screenshots of viral videos, social media comments, and memes, all evidence, she claimed, of the psychological damage his revenge had caused. Karen was no longer fighting for control of a neighborhood. She was fighting to reclaim her identity. The irony, of course, was that the same world she had once used to enforce rules was now using those same rules against her. But humiliation has a way of rewriting reason. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, rereading the papers. He could almost see her behind the words, her posture stiff, her voice sharp, her obsession undimmed. It was a last-ditch attempt to turn back time, to restore the illusion of power that had already evaporated. But he also knew something she didn't. Karen might have been ruthless with HOA bylaws, but the courtroom was a different battlefield. There, emotion didn't rule, evidence did. And he had plenty of it. He contacted a local attorney, a calm man who'd seen too many suburban wars to be surprised by anything. After reading through the documents, he simply nodded and said that Karen's case was more performance than practicality. The legal grounds were weak. But weak cases can still cause chaos. And chaos was exactly what followed. Over the next weeks, Havenbrook Meadows became a circus of speculation. Neighbors whispered about court summonses, subpoenas, and deposition notices. Some sympathized with Daniel, others, surprisingly, began to pity Karen. They said she'd lost everything, her reputation, her friends, even her savings, and that this lawsuit was her final attempt at relevance. But pity didn't change the fact that she was dangerous when cornered. Karen represented herself in the early hearings, unable to afford the full-time lawyer she'd hired to draft the suit. She appeared in court with binders stacked high, each one labeled with the same obsessive care she'd once used to catalog HOA violations. She came armed not with law, but with emotion, long speeches about betrayal, community, and respect. The judge listened politely, but Daniel could see the fatigue behind his eyes. Karen's words weren't legal arguments, they were memories turned into grievances. Her voice cracked when she spoke about the trash heap. Her tone hardened when she described the viral fame. In her mind, she wasn't the villain of Havenbrook, she was the victim of public mockery, of a neighbor's cruelty, of a world that had turned her into a joke. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't even feel triumphant. Watching her unravel in front of strangers felt hollow. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone destroy themselves so completely. But Karen mistook his silence for arrogance. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. News channels had caught wind of the story again. The HOA feud that went viral now heads to court. Reporters hounded both sides for statements. Karen embraced it, dressing immaculately, rehearsing her expressions, using every camera as if it were her jury. She wanted control again, and attention was the closest thing to it. As the hearings progressed, her tactics grew erratic. She flooded the court with irrelevant documents, HOA budgets, neighborhood maps, even screenshots of random comments from strangers online. She accused Daniel of conspiring with the city inspectors. She claimed the dumpster incident had caused her property's emotional devaluation. The judge remained patient, but each filing made her case weaker. And then came the turning point. Daniel's attorney presented a compiled record of Karen's HOA misconduct, the same evidence uncovered during the city's investigation. Falsified fines, misused funds, dozens of neighbor testimonies describing harassment and threats. The courtroom, once filled with whispers, fell silent as the documents were read aloud. Karen's face froze. Every defense she'd built collapsed under the weight of her own history. The judge dismissed her emotional distress claim outright. The defamation charge was denied. The property complaint was sent for further review, but the tone of the room had already changed. The authority she once projected was gone. For the first time, Karen looked small. Human. Defeated. Outside, the cameras waited again. But this time, she didn't stop to speak. She pushed past them, face hidden behind dark sunglasses, her clipboard clutched like a relic from another life. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, but its outcome was inevitable. The court dismissed most of her claims, ordering her to pay part of Daniel's legal fees. By the time it ended, she had nothing left to fight with, not money, not influence, not allies. Still, Karen refused to disappear quietly. She began posting online again, under aliases. She wrote long, furious posts about neighbor betrayal and the death of civility. She blamed the HOA board, the city, the media, everyone but herself. And though most ignored her, a few strangers online encouraged her delusion, feeding the narrative that she'd been wronged. Daniel didn't respond. He had moved past her words, past her noise. He spent his days restoring his home, repainting, repairing, planting new grass where the trash pile once stood. Havenbrook was quieter now. The HOA had dissolved permanently, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood committee that valued cooperation over control. For a while it seemed over. But peace in Havenbrook was never meant to last. Because one morning, Daniel woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside. He stepped onto his porch and saw it. A convoy of garbage trucks parked in front of Karen's house. City workers stood by, holding orders stamped by environmental services. The foreclosure was final. Her home was to be condemned and cleared. Neighbors watched as the trucks moved in, scooping debris and dismantling the last traces of Karen's kingdom. The sight was surreal. The same woman who had once weaponized trash had now become buried beneath it. By sunset, her house stood hollow. Curtains gone. Windows dark. The property seized for cleanup, notice taped to the door. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Some said she'd left town. Others whispered she was staying with relatives. A few claimed to have seen her car parked near the old HOA office, sitting alone in the dark. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the Queen of Havenbrook was gone. Daniel stood at the edge of the street that night, the cool air heavy with silence. The war was over, not with victory, but with exhaustion. No one had truly won. But just as the quiet began to settle, a soft thud echoed from his porch. Another envelope. Smaller this time. Handwritten. No law firm seal, just a single sentence scrawled on the front: "You can't clean what's already rotten." There was no signature, but Daniel didn't need one. Karen wasn't gone. Not completely. And in the distance, beyond the empty streetlights of Havenbrook, a single house flickered back to life. Weeks passed after the foreclosure, and Havenbrook Meadows began to breathe again. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The sound of children playing returned to the sidewalks. Lawns were no longer identical, yet somehow more alive. Without Karen Whitmore's endless watch, the neighborhood began to heal in its own imperfect way. Daniel found himself almost forgetting the constant tension that had once ruled his mornings. He could leave his trash can out an extra day without a photo showing up online. He could park slightly crooked without a letter in his mailbox. The ghost of Karen's clipboard no longer haunted his every move. But peace in Havenbrook was never built to last. It started subtly: an unfamiliar car parked near the corner house late at night, lights off, engine idling. Then came the flyers, slipped under doors and pinned to community boards. Each one printed in crisp black ink: Havenbrook Renewal Initiative, restoring order and beauty to our community. The name printed at the bottom made Daniel's stomach tighten. K. Whitmore, founder. At first, the neighbors thought it was a joke. Someone even posted a picture of the flyer online with the caption, "Didn't she move to the dump?" It got thousands of laughs. But by the end of the week, the joke wasn't funny anymore. Karen was back. No longer as the head of an HOA. Those days were over, but as something new, something worse. She had reinvented herself as the head of a private, neighborhood improvement consultancy. Independent from the HOA system, answerable to no one but her own will. And her first client was Havenbrook Meadows. No one knew how she'd managed it. Rumor had it she'd convinced a group of distant investors that the neighborhood had lost property value under poor civic management. She presented herself as the only one capable of restoring order. Whatever story she sold, it worked. Because within days, city contractors appeared, taking evaluation surveys around the neighborhood. Signs went up reading "Community Assessment in Progress." It felt like the beginning of something familiar. Daniel's neighbors began receiving letters again, this time from Karen's new company, Havenbrook Renewal LLC. The tone was civil, but the message was chillingly similar to the HOA days. Notices of non-compliance, yard violations, and recommended corrective measures. Her power had returned, not through votes or committees, but through contracts and loopholes. The city had granted her company temporary oversight of local beautification efforts. It wasn't an HOA, but it was close enough. The neighborhood that had just started to breathe was suffocating again. Karen's truck, painted white with her company logo, became a familiar sight once more, cruising slowly through the streets. Her clipboard was gone, replaced by a tablet. Her tone was different too, colder, more professional. She wasn't shouting anymore. She was documenting, quietly rebuilding the walls she had once ruled behind. Daniel felt the weight of déjà vu pressing against his chest. But this time, he wasn't the same man she'd cornered years ago. He knew her tactics. He knew her weaknesses. And more importantly, he knew her audience. If Karen was going to rebuild her image in public, then public opinion would be her battlefield. Daniel began documenting again, quietly, carefully. He recorded her inspections, her notices, her conversations with workers. He gathered the new letters neighbors received, each stamped with her name and signature. Then he did what Karen had never expected. He turned the lens back on her. One night, he uploaded a video to a popular Suburban drama channel. Title: "She's Back, HOA Karen Returns Under a New Name." It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Footage of her trucks, copies of her notices, screenshots of her LLC registration. He narrated calmly, showing how she'd used loopholes to regain authority. There was no anger in his tone, just quiet disbelief that one woman could be so relentless in her obsession with control. Within 48 hours, the video exploded. Comments flooded in. "She's unstoppable. How is this even legal? She's the final boss of HOAs." Once again, Karen was viral. But this time, it wasn't over a trash can, it was about the system she'd built to reclaim her throne. The backlash came fast. City officials, already burned by her past reputation, began receiving hundreds of emails and calls demanding to know why she was allowed back. Reporters returned. The same camera crews who had once filmed her breakdown now showed up at her company office, microphones ready. Karen refused to speak. For days, she hid behind tinted windows. Her workers stopped coming to the neighborhood. Her signs were quietly removed at night by angry residents. Havenbrook turned against her. But Karen wasn't done. She never was. Late one evening, Daniel saw her again for the first time in months. She stood at the edge of his driveway, staring at his trash cans, 3 of them lined up neatly under the streetlight. Her face was pale, her hands empty. There was no clipboard, no camera. Just silence. She stood there for a long time, unmoving, before walking back to her car and driving off. The next morning his mailbox was full again. Not with letters, but with trash. Crumpled papers, old food wrappers, and a single photo, a screenshot of her yard from the viral dumpster video, circled in red marker with the words, "You started this." The message was clear. The queen of trash had returned to her throne, not in power, but in vengeance. That night, Daniel sat in the dark, watching the security camera feed on his phone. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, a flicker of movement. A shadow crossed his lawn, crouched near his bins, and disappeared into the dark. He didn't sleep after that. The next morning, the trash can lids were open again. Someone had emptied a bucket of rotten leaves and construction debris across his driveway. It wasn't random. It was symbolic. Karen had gone from lawsuits and letters to silent warfare. Small acts. Psychological blows. She wasn't trying to destroy him publicly anymore. She wanted to haunt him privately. Daniel considered calling the police, but there was no proof. No direct evidence, no witnesses. She was too careful now. And yet, despite the harassment, he refused to react. He cleaned it up, set the bins back, and carried on as if nothing had happened. Because he knew that in every story of Karen's downfall, her real enemy was never her victims. It was herself. And sure enough, the spiral began again. Neighbors started posting footage of her nighttime visits. Someone caught her dragging a trash bag across a lawn at 2 a.m. Another camera recorded her muttering to herself near a street sign. The videos went viral instantly, turning her into an urban legend. The trash phantom of Havenbrook. The nickname spread faster than any HOA rumor ever had. Kids joked about seeing her near dumpsters. Teenagers filmed Karen sightings for likes. The woman who once obsessed over perfection had become the embodiment of the very chaos she'd tried to control. By the time city officials intervened again, Karen was gone. Her company website shut down. Her phone disconnected. Her home, what remained of it, was abandoned, windows dark and curtains torn. Havenbrook returned to silence, this time for good. But Daniel knew silence didn't erase memory. Every time he rolled his trash can to the curb, he still felt her presence. Every distant hum of an engine at night made him look twice. And sometimes, when the wind carried the faint sound of rattling metal, he couldn't tell if it was just the breeze or something else. Because somewhere out there, the woman who once ruled a neighborhood of perfection was still wandering, chasing a fight she could never win. And for Daniel, that thought was the only thing that ever truly kept him awake at night. Months passed. Havenbrook Meadows had finally settled into a strange calm. The lawns grew uneven. Paints began to fade. But the people were happier than ever. For the first time in years, life in the suburb wasn't about matching fences or spotless driveways. It was about breathing again. Daniel often found himself sitting on his porch in the early evenings, listening to the quiet hum of sprinklers and the laughter of children in the distance. The days of letters and confrontations felt like a lifetime ago. Sometimes he wondered if Karen had ever really existed, or if she had simply been the embodiment of something that existed in all of them, the need to control what could never truly be perfect. But peace in Havenbrook was a fragile thing, easily disturbed. One cold morning, while the fog still hung low over the streets, Daniel noticed something strange. The old house that had once belonged to Karen, the one that had sat abandoned for months, now had its porch light on. The yard, once an overgrown mess, had been cleared. A large metal dumpster sat in the driveway. It was as if someone had finally come to finish what she started. Curiosity tugged at him, but unease held him back. Nobody in the neighborhood had seen anyone move in. The mailbox still bore the faded Whitmore nameplate. Yet, the light inside flickered every night now, glowing faintly through the blinds like a heartbeat. Then, one morning, the trash began appearing again. Not in front of Daniel's house this time, but scattered around the empty lots, at the edges of lawns, even across the main street. Small piles, perfectly placed like offerings. Plastic bottles lined up in rows, crushed cans, and torn HOA letters with the words, "Restoration Notice," printed on them. It was too deliberate to be random. Too personal to be a prank. The neighbors whispered that Karen had returned, haunting her old domain. Others claimed it was someone copying her as a joke. But deep down, Daniel knew the truth. The woman who had built an empire of rules and ruin would never leave quietly. He decided to go back to the house one last time. The yard was silent except for the low creak of the dumpster lid swaying in the wind. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, damp paper, old food, and something metallic beneath it. He stepped closer, brushing past the sign that still read, "Property under renewal." Inside the dumpster was not what he expected. There were no garbage bags or construction debris. Instead, it was filled with fragments of her past. Torn HOA letters. Broken clipboards. Empty notebooks. A cracked nameplate that once read, "Karen Whitmore, HOA President." It wasn't trash. It was a graveyard of her obsession. At the very bottom, buried beneath the ruined papers, lay a single photo. A picture of Karen standing in front of her pristine lawn, smiling stiffly with a trash can beside her. The same photo Daniel had seen years ago on the HOA newsletter. Someone had scribbled across it in black ink, "Perfection never lasts." He left the dumpster untouched. That evening, as he walked home, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Police cars, flashing red and blue, passed by toward the outskirts. The next morning, news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen Whitmore had been found. Her body was discovered near an abandoned recycling plant on the edge of town. The police described it as an accident, exposure, and exhaustion. She'd apparently been living there for weeks, surrounded by piles of discarded papers, filing cabinets, and broken bins. To most of the world, it was a tragic footnote. To Havenbrook, it was the final chapter in a story that had consumed too many years. The local news called it the fall of the HOA queen. Online, the videos about her skyrocketed again. Old clips resurfaced, her arguments, her breakdowns, her return. But beneath the jokes and comments, a strange sadness ran through the story. People realized she wasn't just a villain, she was the cautionary tale of what happens when control becomes obsession. For Daniel, it wasn't victory. It was closure. He returned to her house one last time, as cleanup crews arrived to haul the dumpster away. He watched in silence as the crane lifted it, the metal clanging like a final bell. The workers didn't realize the symbolism, but he did. The same woman who had once called the cops over a trash can was now being remembered through one. As the truck drove away, the last trace of her reign disappeared into the horizon. Weeks later, the house was sold. A young couple moved in, cheerful, optimistic, unaware of the ghosts that had once haunted those streets. They painted the walls bright yellow, planted flowers, and installed a swing on the porch. Life went on quietly, as if the neighborhood had decided to forgive itself. But the story of Karen Whitmore lived online forever. Clips of her encounters, interviews, and Daniel's recordings continued to circulate, millions of views, endless debates. She became a symbol of something larger, not just HOA power, but the darker side of suburban perfection. In the comment sections, people argued endlessly. Was she evil, or just broken by her own standards? Was Daniel a hero, or just another player in her downfall? For Daniel, none of it mattered anymore. He'd learned that revenge doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes, it looks like peace. Sometimes, it's simply moving on while the other person stays trapped in the mess they made. He spent his evenings tending his garden again, no longer trimming the edges to perfection, just letting it grow as it pleased. The trash cans still stood by the curb every Friday, but now they meant something else. A quiet reminder that not everything needs to be spotless to be right. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustled through the leaves, he could almost hear the faint echo of Karen's voice, not shouting, not scolding, just whispering through the air like a ghost of the past. Keep it clean. The sound faded as quickly as it came. He looked up at the stars, took a deep breath, and smiled. Because at last, Havenbrook Meadows was free. And the trash, both literal and human, had finally been taken out.